Welcome everyone to this virtual gallery talk focusing on the exhibition Envisioning Evil, the Nazi Drawings by Mauricio Lasansky. My name is Molly. I work here at MIA, and it is my pleasure to introduce the exhibition curator, Associate Curator of European Art, Rachel McGarry.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks everyone for being here today. We opened the exhibition last Saturday, and it is such an honor to share it all with you today. But first, it's a great privilege to introduce my co-presenter, Rabbi Barry Cytron. He is an important collaborator on the project. He contributed a very thoughtful essay to the catalog, which is now available in our museum shop, Envisioning Evil. And his essay was on the impact of the Holocaust on Christian and Jewish faith and interfaith dialogue after the war. And he's been an indispensable counsel. He's provided indispensable counsel throughout the project at every stage. I just want to say briefly, Rabbi Cytron's background. He recently retired from Macalester College, where he was a beloved professor of religious studies and a chaplain for 28 years. And before that, he was a congregational rabbi in Des Moines, Iowa, and later at the Synagogue of Adath in Minnesota, which many of you all know, where he now serves as senior scholar. And he's very active locally and nationally in interfaith relations, education, and scholarship, and we're really lucky to have him here today. So the plan, so welcome, Rabbi Cytron. The plan today is we'll start with a brief 9-minute video for you all to kind of see the exhibition space and the drawings. And then we'll follow that with, I'll give remarks for 15 minutes. Rabbi Cytron will give remarks for 15 minutes, and we'll have a question answer period after that, which we really look forward to hearing people's questions. So with that, Brian, I'll let you start the video.
Hi, I'm Rachel McGarry. I'm an associate curator at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. We are in the exhibition Envisioning Evil, the Nazi Drawings by Mauricio Lasansky. The Nazi drawings were executed in the 1960s by the Argentine-American artist Mauricio Lasansky. He was born in Argentina to Jewish parents from Lithuania, and he emigrated to the United States in 1943. Lasansky began the Nazi drawings in 1961, and he worked on them for the next 10 years. They really represent the artist's personal response to the Holocaust. They're raw, they're expressive, they're haunting, they're colossal in scale. You'll see that Lasansky deploys a cast of terrifying, brutish figures, menacing skulls, anguished victims, and his anger is palpable. In 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the notorious war criminal, was underway in Jerusalem. This is the first televised trial that was broadcast across the globe. And at the trial, 90 Holocaust survivors testified. This was a watershed moment as far as understanding the Holocaust as a distinct, catastrophic tragedy of World War II. Finally, the world understood what the Holocaust was. The world was riveted by his capture, by his trial, and afterwards, a number of other Nazi criminals were tried, especially in West Germany. And people really became much more interested in understanding what had happened, in talking to survivors and reading their stories, and filmmakers, artists, playwrights really brought the story of the Holocaust to life in the 1960s and forward. So the first thing you see when you come into the exhibition is these Nazi busts that he executed in 1961. And right at this moment, the world is fixated on this trial of Adolf Eichmann. You know, he was famously tried in this glass bulletproof box, and the world watched this man as survivor after survivor told their harrowing story of how their families were murdered and their villages were wiped out and their families were taken to Auschwitz on trains that Eichmann had organized. And commentators were absolutely disturbed by the ordinary appearance of Eichmann in that glass box. He just looked like an ordinary man, a functionary, a bureaucrat. He didn't look like a mass murderer. And so Lasansky is really showing these Nazis sort of being consumed and devoured by this evil, you know, the skull cap, the teeth visor, the muzzle. They're silenced, they're dehumanized. As you move through the exhibition, and you come into the second gallery, you'll see the drawings in which he treats the victims of the Nazis, the 6 million. And women and children are really central to the Nazi drawings, to their suffering and their agony. And you come upon number 13 here. This is the first drawing you're greeted by when you come into the second room of the exhibition. And you see a female corpse suspended from some kind of scaffolding. And if you look above her head, she actually has her hands grasped as though she's praying. And she's being strung by her own garments. There's a terrifying beast is kind of coming at her along with a bird of prey who looks like he might peck on her. And what I find is such a terrifying detail is this hand coming from the ground and gripping her foot and pulling her foot down into the earth. As you move into this larger space, you'll see a series of drawings in which Lasansky deploys Christian iconography, crucifixions, pietas, and he uses it as a symbol not of Christ's suffering, but of the Jewish suffering and the martyrdom of the Jews in the Holocaust. So we're looking at number 18 here, and he shows this mother and child crucified upside down on a cross made of collage newspaper. And if you look at the collage newspaper, there's actually a headline from a trial going on in Frankfurt of Auschwitz guards being tried in 1963. The mother's body is totally broken and mutilated. The child on her belly, you have to come in close to see. He or she's resting on her stomach, still pink, it seems, with life. This is a really powerful drawing. And you move forward, and here, number 15, as I said, women and children and their suffering was central in the Nazi drawings. And here you see a mother holding her dead baby, its stomach swollen as though it's probably starved to death, and her little girl in her red coat at her side, nestled at her side, and this terrifying white beast of death descends over the mother and children and points in the direction as though sending them off to the gas chambers. As we move forward, and we're standing in front of number 23, you'll see a child crucified on a cross. He's surrounded by these birds of prey, and they've already begun to peck at his body. And he's being held up in a kind of pietà by a bishop or pope figure. On the child's stomach, in very light graphite, are 2 stars of David. These are the only stars of David you'll see in the entire series. Lasansky was focused on the Holocaust in the Nazi drawings, but he also wanted to remember all of the Nazi victims, the Roma and Sinti, the ethnic Polish children, the Soviet POWs, and he worried that minorities were at risk in the future for similar genocides. And so he really wanted to make that point in the Nazi drawing series. So you'll see that there's only 3 swastikas in the entire series, and then these 2 stars of David, because he wanted to universalize the tragedy. On this large wall, you'll see 5 large drawings of children. And this is really a moving part of the exhibition. You'll see these children screaming in agony, suffering. In a few of them stenciled numbers 5,602,715, which is thought to have at the time been the estimate of the number of Jews murdered in the Holocaust. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered by the Nazis. And this part of the series addresses this hideous tragedy of the 20th century. In the center, the child screaming in agony. This is the largest drawing in the series. So this was really an important part of the series for Lasansky. They scream silently. It's haunting to look at these drawings. They're colossal in scale. They're over life size. There's no one there to help them. They're alone in their last moments. This one on the left, you'll see is almost lightly drawn, and there's some erasures, so it's almost like the child is disappearing in our midst. And when you turn here to this figure on the final wall of a woman crucified on a kind of cross, it's one of the most iconic drawings, I think, in the series. It's really powerful. It's about the murder and desecration of the bodies by the Nazis. Her feet are, gripped in pain. There's blood dripping onto the scripture. You again see this stenciled number. This particular cross is papered with scripture that he's scratched out and cut and cropped, and there's blood throughout. And it's a powerful thing to look at. There are thousands of strokes of graphite going across the entire background. If you look at the top part, you can see there's this sheen from how hard he pressed on the graphite, and it goes all the way down to the bottom. And you'll also see tack marks. He pulled, he was very rough in his handling of the drawings. These weren't meant to be, beautiful works of art to look at. These were really, expressions of his state of mind in trying to understand the evil that happened.
For me, the show really reminds me of the power of art. These are not subtle works. They're executed with purpose and profound feeling, and I think Lasansky's rage combined with his extraordinary draftsmanship makes a powerful statement. These drawings are intense and upsetting and haunting and formidable. It is, I think, a once-in-a-generation chance to see them, and you won't forget it.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. I have to say to Mike, Austin, Ryan Lee for, I'm going to share my screen here, for pulling together that preview of the exhibition of the Nazi drawings on view since last Saturday through next June 26th. And I want to thank the Levitt Foundation for lending the series to us, and I'll get to their part of the story in a minute. I'm sorry that we didn't have someone a bit more comfortable in front of the camera to present the drawings to you. I think we'll try to get Neil Day-Lewis or Ann Curry or someone next time. But I just hope this teaser makes you want to come down to the museum, because the drawings is, when you're face to face with these large scale works, and you can see the layered collage here, scripture, and the expressive strokes of and execution, and their rough handling. I mean, he tore these drawings. He was angry when he was working on them, and these are not polished, elegant works of art, and they're visceral. And so you can see the collage elements, all this kind of thing is so difficult to understand. But when you're face to face with these drawings, and they're actually almost scary and unforgettable. So we have this spread from the catalog showing the 33 drawings in the series, and you'll see that they're all different sizes, different subject matter, different media. Some have collage. He numbered the drawings rather than naming the drawings, except for the last triptych that's at the end of the series. And he undertook the project. He executed these in the 1960s, and they went on a 9-city tour across North America. And everywhere they went, they, were received by crowds and critical acclaim. So here is when it was at the Breuer, the Whitney Breuer, it was the inaugural exhibition of the Marcel Breuer building on the Whitney on Madison Avenue. And here's Mauricio with his wife Amelia at the opening, and you can see crowds lined up outside the museum to go in to see the show. And so as the exhibition toured North America from 1967 to 1970, there was a lot of interest in, I'm just starting my time so I don't go over. There was a lot of interest by institutions to acquire individual drawings in the series, but the artists really wanted to keep them together. And the Levitt family, Mr. and Mrs. Levitt, art collectors and philanthropists from Des Moines, Iowa, who had attended the University of Iowa, where Lasansky was a professor, which I'll get to in a second. They stepped up and they acquired the entire series for their family foundation so that they could be kept together. And so the Levitt Foundation has cared for these drawings and made them available in intervening years, subsequent years, for loan, and they've recently conserved them. They were in a conservation campaign in 2016, 2017. So, and so we are very grateful for the Levitts for lending them to the Minneapolis Institute of Art for this show. The artist, as I mentioned in the tour, was born in Buenos Aires. He's the son of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania. In 1943, at the age of 29, he emigrated to the United States, where he became an internationally renowned printmaker. And we have some of his prints on view, including the two I show here, actually the three I show here by the artist, in a gallery adjacent to our exhibition. So he was a revered professor at the University of Iowa for 65 years and really established one of the preeminent printmaking programs in the United States. And in 1961, when he began the Nazi drawings, Time magazine declared Lasansky, quote, the nation's most influential printmaker. He had treated the subject of war and Nazi atrocities right after the war in the 40s. And I showed two works that deal with this, Apocalyptical Space and Dachau from the mid 40s. And in this point, he's, working in a sort of abstract expressionist style. And so he sort of communicates and evokes the brutality of the Nazis through his rough technique, again, his gouging, scratching of the plate, jarring lines and so on. But he sort of set the subject aside after these works. He decided that while the Holocaust had gnawed at him, as he said in many interviews later, for many years, he just put it aside until 1961 when he started the Nazi drawings. So as I said, while 30 of the drawings toured in the late 1960s, Lasansky actually completed Triptych, which is a set of three large panels. These are among the largest in the group. He worked on these while the others were touring the country, and they sort of bring the issues of the Nazi series squarely into the 1960s. You'll see lots of newspaper clippings from the 60s, which we'll discuss later. So one of the things from the outset, when I began to research for the exhibition, was trying to understand why Lasansky started work on this in the 1960s. Like, what was happening? Why didn't he work on this? This is 11 years after the close of the war. This was 11 years after the liberation of the concentration camps in Germany, when the world discovered what was going on during the war. And I was wondering also, why was there such a captive audience in 1967 to 70, people wanting to see this? And so that's just something I just want to dive into here shortly. That historian, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Tony Judt and his incredible book, Post-War Europe, which I highly recommend, from 2005. And he writes, quote, in retrospect, Auschwitz is the most important thing to know about World War II, but that is not how things seemed at the time. And that's precisely what anybody researching this will find out, to their shock. I think most people. I mean, here we're looking at one of the most iconic photos of the Holocaust, of women and children being escorted outside of the Warsaw Ghetto during the 1943 ghetto uprising. And these women and children will be, deported to Auschwitz, where they'll be murdered. And this young boy in the middle with his hands up at gunpoint has never, still his identity remains unknown. And while it's hardly a mystery of what happened to the Jews of Europe during the war, much of the Holocaust and the early aftermath of the war was invisible, silenced, and erased. And if you look, what I did is I went through the newspapers from 1938 to 1945. I read the cover of the New York Times every day to see how the Holocaust was covered by the newspapers. And I was shocked to find that it was not only underreported, but it was almost entirely absent. And so after Hitler's rise to power in 1933, the American press did cover the persecution of the Jews in Germany. But that, as the war escalated, and then particularly after the Americans entered the war in 1941 following Pearl Harbor, that story practically disappeared. Now, in April of 1945, when the camps are being liberated in Germany by the British and American troops, you start to see stories appearing. This one on April 18th, 1945, where they talk about the Nazi death factory, and then more details of what's happening at Buchenwald, this camp in Germany, are discussed on page 8. You'll see, when you just look at this big spread of day-to-day war, the setbacks, the advances of the armies, that's really what is being covered in the papers. And things like this is one of the biggest headlines because it's actually on the front page news. But the stories tend to get hidden. Here is the first report on Buchenwald in April 13th, 1945. And you'll see that the prisoners at the camp are described as political prisoners. And there were political prisoners there, and there were Jewish prisoners alike. But that was often the language you find in the press and also by the military discussing victims of the Nazis. And here on April 29th, the Allied forces released an official report on the atrocities at Buchenwald. And you'll see this is very typical here where it says 20,000 prisoners were found, and then they're described by nationality, 2,900 French, 3,800 Poles, and so on. And as you go deeper into the catalog, we finally get some mention of Jewish victims of the Nazis. It says, but it starts out, anyone and everyone of outstanding intellectual or moral qualifications or of democratic or anti-Nazi inclinations or their relatives. For instance, as to the French inmates, they include 4 anti-Vichy members of parliament. So they're describing the kinds of prisoners here, and it goes on: French engineers, lawyers, editors, and other professionals, men of higher brackets. The prisoners included 4,000 prominent Jews, and the Jews were given even worse treatment than the others. Maybe so, but genocide here is hidden. These are listed as among other political prisoners. And so the Jewish dimension of the tragedy, the genocide's really overlooked, ignored, buried, misunderstood. And if you listen to Edward Murrow's famous radio broadcast from Buchenwald, or you look at the Life magazine May 7th issue on the atrocities of the concentration camps, Jewish prisoners are not mentioned. Jewish victims are not mentioned. Same goes for the newsreels. So it's no wonder in 1945 in May, after all of this coverage, extensive coverage of the Nazi camps, people surveyed in the United States thought that the Nazis had killed a total of 1 million Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners altogether. You know, the scope of the and the Jewish story was mentioned was lost. And it just point out this one photo that was published in the New York Times on April 29th. You can just glimpse Elie Wiesel's head here on the right, I don't know, far right, among the prisoners at Buchenwald. In 1952, Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank, finally found an English publisher for his the wartime diary of his daughter Anne. And Otto Frank had lost both his wife and his 2 teenage daughters to the Holocaust. And the diary, as we all know, is a lively account by a brilliant young writer, Anne Frank, of her family's 2-year hiding in a small apartment she called the Secret Annex, which was, in the heart of Amsterdam. It was published in the Netherlands in 1947 and in Germany in translation in 1950, but it was rejected by 16 publishers in the United States and Great Britain before it was finally published in 1952. And after that, in the 50s, the diary just took off. By 1960, 700,000 copies of the book had been sold in Germany, making it the best-selling paperback of all time at that time. And today it's been translated, I think over 30 million copies have sold since. It's been translated into 70 languages. And so Anne's book went a long way in humanizing the Holocaust and sort of individualizing the 6 million murdered Jews. It did so in a way that was palatable for the 1950s. And there was a television play on CBS that followed the publication of the diary right in 1952. Then it was followed by a Broadway play in 1955. In 1959, there was the movie directed by George Stevens. This movie poster, which we illustrate in the catalog, almost looks like a poster for a rom-com rather than a movie or a subject dealing with the Holocaust. And my mass market, I searched this out. I found the mass market paperback from my youth. This is published in the 1980s, where it is still being marketed as a song to life, as you see on the background. And what was crazy is when you look at this book, I'm sure a lot of you have the copy of this book that was distributed in those days. It has 8 film stills from the movie and only 2 photos of Anne, which is just, makes no sense. And the famous Bert Steichen's famous Family of Anne exhibition at MoMA in 1955 excerpted quotes of famous people, and the quote excerpted and posted in the exhibition from Anne Frank is, "I still believe that people are really good at heart." So it's trying to tell a particular story. Cynthia Ozick, I highly recommend this New Yorker article she published in 1997, offered a biting critique of how many people have distorted and falsified Anne's diary. And as her photo caption here, as the caption to the article says, "To believe that the diary was a song to life is to stew in an ugly innocence." She goes through and really shows all the omissions in the 1950s printings. Her father approved of these omissions, taking out much. She wrote about her Jewish faith, about anti-Semitism in the Netherlands. She wrote about her sister Margot's Zionism. Those passages were all removed for the publications. They have since been restored, but they only after Otto Frank's death in the 90s. And part of its success in the 1950s was universalizing Anne's story, and also it's a story about the Holocaust that really takes the Holocaust out of it. The Holocaust happens after. So Anne's last dated entry is August 1st, 1944, and she's captured 3 days later. She and her family and all the other people hiding in the secret annex. And the horrible last few months of her life are not told here. So it was something that the book went a long way in humanizing one of the victims of the Nazi atrocities, but it did so in a very compromised way originally. And I think now we can read a much more, restored and true to Anne version of the story. But looking at how things were looked at the 50s, you look at something like Lasansky's drawings in the 60s, and there's nothing here that you would describe as a song to life. And, his drawings are terrifying and angry and dark. And he's really coming to grips with the calamity and the evil and the suffering. And what had changed? Well, we discussed in the video, you saw that the Adolf Eichmann trial was a watershed moment, really, in the understanding of the Holocaust. He was captured in Buenos Aires, Lasansky's hometown, and he was smuggled out of Argentina and brought to Jerusalem by Israel's intelligence agency Mossad, and tried in Jerusalem in 1961. And it was a riveting story. I have these TV guide posts here, but it was run on the nightly news and during the dinner hour in America. It was broadcast in 38 countries. It's the first trial to be broadcast across the globe, and it's estimated that 80% of television viewers watched it around the world. He was tried on 15 counts of crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and was found guilty and executed in 1962 by hanging. And this television broadcast really propelled the Holocaust into the mainstream. And right at the moment that everyone's sort of fixated on this notorious war criminal, Lasansky began his series. And he starts with these 4 lone Nazi soldiers, which he executed in 1961. And he shows them in they're individuated. Each one has their own facial features, ears, nose, but they're being consumed by these skull masks. Their teeth visors blinding their eyes. Their military uniforms are muzzling their mouths. They're not speaking. Their consciences are obliterated. They're blinded. And as you go on, you'll see that they become more and more consumed by beastly creatures. And during the trial, a lot of the commentators were really, as I noted in the preview, were horrified by the ordinariness of his appearance. And 6 psychiatrists certified Eichmann as normal, but one psychiatrist declared, quote, "more normal at any rate than I am after examining him." So, how does a desk, bureaucrat he was head of Jewish affairs for the Gestapo, and he arranged the trains of millions of Jewish people to death camps. And how does this, it seems like in this part of the series, Lasansky's really coming to the grips of how ordinary men become beastly, evil Nazis. And then what the most important thing, I think, the legacy of the Eichmann trial is the testimonies of the survivors. Over 90 survivors testified in many languages: Yiddish, French, Dutch, German, Polish, really demonstrating the terrifying reach of the Third Reich. And each person told a story. They suddenly had a name, a family, a hometown, and it changed everything, because there had only been 3 Holocaust survivors that testified in the Nuremberg trials. This was completely different. And so this abstract number of the 6 million really comes to life at this moment. And from now on, from the 60s forward, there is great interest in reading survivor stories, of preserving survivor stories. There's archives, there's Shoah, there's Claude Lanzmann's Shoah film that he filmed in the 70s, which is the most incredible 9.5 hours of film. And I don't know if any of you have read the Norwegian writer Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's written this 6-volume memoir, My Struggle, as in Mein Conflict after Hitler. I'm in the 6th volume right now, and he says, I think, just bear with me, I'm not the best reader out loud, I'm not an actor or anything, but the way he explains this anonymity of the 6 million and how problematic it was. he starts in this area, discussing the chilling silence of the hidden Nazi extermination camps. I'm just going to talk for a couple more minutes here, sorry, and then I will turn it over. But here's what he says. How was it possible that so many could fall so silent? Where were they? The stillness is the stillness of the void, descending when what was no longer is. And it is this that makes what took place so impossible to comprehend. For the extermination of the Jews is that which is not. Indeed, it is nothing. How are we to relate to it in any real way? If we select someone to represent it, an individual with a name and a history, family and friends, we are addressing it through the fate of the individual, thereby lending it dignity. For the person in question was indeed dignified by virtue of being human, yet it was precisely the human dignity that was absent in the Holocaust, and the absence which made it possible. If we do not select someone to represent it, we are depriving the victims of their names, construing them as 6 million, generalizing the atrocity, and thereby falling short, quite as short, since it was not 6 million Jews who were exterminated, but one by one, 6 million times. And I think that's really what happens after this trial. And so that you'll see that the series, well, first of all, if you search how the word Holocaust is used in books, you can do a Google Books search, and you can see that Holocaust is used in all sorts of ways, but suddenly starting in the 1960s, Holocaust with a capital H comes to represent for the world, and it's interchangeable with Shoah, and you can do the same search with Shoah, but that this is a unique, distinct, horrific tragedy of a attempted Jewish genocide of the Jewish people by the Nazis. And it emerges as something in its own. And unprecedented, and it's universally understood this way. So later in the series, really looking at the victims, Lasansky changes gears from looking at the Nazis and trying to understand the evil they did to looking at the suffering of the victims of the Nazis. And as I said, really centralizing women and children. And it makes for a very powerful experience, difficult experience in attending the show. And I'll just, before I turn it over to Rabbi Cytron here, just say that the series ends here with a self-portrait of Lasansky, who has, this is the last one in the series where he's got his pen here, or pencil, and he's titled it Mauricio Lasansky, and signed his name and titled the series The Nazi Drawings, upside down in the blood. And there's just blood, pouring out of him. A terrifying sort of skeleton is mutilating his head and his heart. And this was really the experience of creating the Nazi drawings. And here's a picture of the artist while he's working on the Nazi drawings in his studio in Maine in 1962. And I interviewed some of his children, and his late son, Philip Lasansky, said that it really was a dark period for the artist, as one can imagine. And, he seems to also be suggesting here that evil lurks in all of us. So the series touches on many sensitive issues, and we're going to turn it over to Rabbi Cytron, but I end here with number 29, where you see he's put a series, piled up a number of young victims at the feet of the religious hierarchy, a pope and a cardinal. And he's really examining a very controversial issue in the 60s of the Catholic and Christian culpability in the Holocaust. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Rabbi Cytron. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much. So I want to begin with just a personal word. Rachel was very gracious to allow some of our family to come last Thursday for a sneak preview. It's quite extraordinary in so many ways, and I am overwhelmed by the presentation that all of us have just experienced with Rachel just now. And I want to turn to the catalog as by way of introduction, because the catalog shows in full display Rachel's scholarship, her devotion and dedication to this project for, the last 3 or more years, I'm guessing. So in the opening pages of the catalog, which accompanies, and you see here on the left, the original catalog done in 1976, very, very humble by comparison to this one. And I think in some ways, the difference between the two catalogs The one from 1976, which contains the drawings and a very brilliant essay by a Brown University historian and literature professor, and the one on the right, which details the Holocaust in a quite extraordinary way by Dr. McGarry. So in that catalog, one of the first pictures that you see is this one on the left, which is it lists those museums and art centers that welcomed the inaugural tour of the drawings between 1967 and 1970. And at one of our first meetings over 2 years ago, Rachel shared the somewhat longer list on the right, which included additional venues where the drawings were shown in subsequent years. That the drawings now will be on view after such a long interval, way too long an interval, is a remarkable testimony to the wisdom and the dedication of the entire staff of MIA, especially, most especially of Rachel, with whom it has been really a singular honor to be associated. Her devotion to this project, alongside her deep learning, as all of us have just experienced, about the artist, the time frame, and the art world in which it came to be, is really breathtaking and on full display. And there is one additional adjective that I think warrants being included about this exhibition now that has just opened at MIA, and that word would be courage. I think it takes enormous guts, as it did certainly in the 1960s, but even today, to show these drawings, as I think we will see when you are overwhelmed by them. And that sense of courage, of really bravery of the art museums which decided to show it and those which didn't, is especially interesting to think about. So when Rachel shared this list with me, I kept wondering about the places where it didn't show. And if you take a look at these lists on both sides now, there is one very notable absence. It's never been shown in California, which is rather astounding, I think. And more interestingly for me as a Midwesterner, where it was shown in Chicago, which is, as you'll see, not at the famous Art Institute, one of our favorite places to go to. It was not shown there when it made its first tour. And Chicago is famous not only for the Art Institute, but for its world-class public sculpture all over the city, which is really astounding. Oh no, when the drawings made their way to Chicago, they went to the Museum of Contemporary Art, and not in its current building either. The Museum of Contemporary Art had just been founded the year before, in 1966, and that's, or 1967, and it just had opened, and it was then in a kind of backwards, kind of a rehabbed bakery that had been turned into an office building and then became a museum, just kind of off the side on Ontario Street, not in its very beautiful building today, right east of Michigan Avenue. So I asked Rachel, so what's going on? Why not at the Art Institute of Chicago? And she said there's a very interesting backstory with a connection to MIA, which perhaps if we have time, she might share with you. But her email to me when I asked that question included this, which was a quite lengthy piece that appeared in the Chicago Daily News a couple years after the exhibit appeared in Chicago. It's not a review per se, but rather a retrospective. And the dateline happens to be Iowa City, where Lasansky was, as you can see here. And as you can see excerpted here in a 4-column spread, the writer of the article reports that Time magazine, he quotes Time magazine reporting that the Art Institute, the famous Art Institute, declined to take the exhibit because, quote, it was so devastating. It also cites other explanations for the show being turned down, either that the curator of prints, quote, feared the reaction of the Institute trustees, which is pretty interesting, or that he was not impressed by Lasansky's work. Hard to believe, especially because the Art Institute itself had a retrospective on Lasansky just a few years before. Well, whatever the rationale for that long ago Chicago decision, the Nazi drawings now to be encountered by all of us, I hope, after a half century of prodigious scholarly investigation of what, as we have heard from Rachel, now we call the Holocaust, or in Hebrew, the Shoah, the word for whirlwind of destruction. The attention which the Holocaust or the Shoah has received over the past decades, from novels, memoirs, movies, plays, the press, today's museum goer brings a much more knowledgeable and a sensitized understanding of the events and of their social and religious implication than was remotely possible in 1967 and 1968. Consider just this one panel, which Rachel and I have spoken a great deal about, and which is very carefully worded. So this is one of the exhibition panels that will greet the visitor when they come through the exhibit. The panel notes that the same years in which Lasansky was at work on the drawings converged with an arduous struggle both within the Catholic Church and by critics from without at examining and contending over the relationship of the church and its leadership to the events of those wartime years. While that call for investigation was largely directed, at least initially, at the actions and the omissions of the church hierarchy, it extended as well to some extent to the thousands of church communities and the millions of devout adherents of the faith and the roles which they played. And other voices would soon appear to begin to force the church to peer inward at its historic views about Judaism and the Jewish people. There are two events, 15 days apart in the spring of 1960, that are now seen as primary catalysts for what has become decades of sustained efforts by Christian theologians and historians and clergy to grapple with the Holocaust and its possible lines of connection to the European genocide. In turn, those two events, 15 days apart in 1960, would have sparked an ongoing study and dialogue and leading, I would say today, to a continuing rapprochement between these two long estranged theological siblings. On May the 23rd, 1960, and you see here on the left, this is a television capture, a video capture of David Ben-Gurion announcing the capture of Adolf Eichmann. Those are the words you see in Hebrew superimposed on David Ben-Gurion's face as he's sitting in front of a microphone making the announcement to the Knesset on May the 29th of the capture of Adolf Eichmann, seen here in the surveillance photo taken by the Mossad and by Shin Bet. That extraterritorial seizure, which we have heard from Rachel about, of this Nazi bureaucrat ignited a cascade of news coverage and, as she said, the first ever televised court, leading to a guilty verdict and his hanging in 1962. And it opened, as she says, the floodgates, and they really are a floodgates to a global reawakening of the events that were obscured by the Cold War of the prior decade, as well as, frankly, a kind of the 1945, 46, 47 desire just to get on with life, to move past the war from everyone. So amid the initial legal and diplomatic controversies surrounding Eichmann's capture 2 weeks later, which is really remarkable, and 1,500 miles to the west, there would be a second reason to look back at those wartime years. On June the 11th, a French survivor of the attempted genocide would be ushered into a meeting with the then reigning pontiff, almost brand new, just there 2 years. As a direct result of that encounter, that very brief encounter, over the next 5 years, a steady stream of steps would be inaugurated, at first incrementally, but then increasingly significantly, setting in motion a profound reshaping of 2 millennia of Christian rhetoric and theology. religion doesn't change easily or slowly, but this was an amazing one to happen in such a short period of time. And in our era has really witnessed a reimagining of the theological relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Jules Isaac, the Sat survivor, was born into an assimilated Jewish family in 1877. His allegiance to France, his family's unqualified patriotism to his country, constituted the very basis of his own personal identity. He would later write, I was a Jew. I did not boast about it. I did not hide it. It was simply a fact. He was educated at the finest schools, including the Sorbonne. His work became a bedrock of the nation's school curriculum. In 1936, he was named to the nation's leading educational position as its inspector general. But neither the accolades which he received nor his stature were of any good once Germany invaded his country. Away from home, when the Gestapo burst into the family hideout, his wife would perish at Auschwitz. An older son was safe, studying abroad in England, and a second son would miraculously be liberated at the camps, from a camp at the war end. Sympathetic Christian clergy shielded Jules Isaac while providing him both material and intellectual provisions, and turning his original expertise in world history now to Christian scripture and commentary, not his specialty. He wrote these two books, which became bedrock books in our understanding of the relationship between Christian thought and anti-Semitism. Very brave, unbelievable subject to take on in the 1950s, actually. His work would eventually lead to that encounter with, as you see here, the man of the year of 1963, John the 23rd. That fateful encounter occurred on the eve, what has come to be known as Vatican II. The Pope, when he had been elected in 1958, following the death of the wartime Pope, and I have to say a word, as that wartime Pope, Pius XII, is examined, and we'll see here on this is the panel, which appears once again at the MIA exhibition. The panel carefully says that Pius XII and his work, his kind of devotion to the church, his devotion to diplomacy. I think we heard from one of our guests who's going to be with us that she said that, and she's a Catholic nun, she said the church needed a prophet and it got a diplomat, I think was her exact quote. And the Vatican archives have just been opened, and as the exhibition panel carefully notes, the release of these documents will, I think, say something to us. We're not sure what, whether they will say something that is in defense or in accusation of the wartime Pope. But he died in 1958. And what happened is that the then John the 23rd decided that it was time to take upon himself to move the church in a totally different direction. His successor, John the 23rd, speaks almost immediately about the need for the church to enter the modern world. And he says here, its principal task will be concerned with the opportunity for the church to become, after 20 centuries, part of the modern world. In summoning the church's leadership to that conclave, which we now call Vatican II popularly, emboldened by this quite aged Jules Isaac, was quite remarkable. Many European Jews, I think, were immediately taken when they heard of the meeting, because they knew some things which were not widely known about John the 23rd, which is he had been stationed before he became back to Italy as an archbishop, he had been stationed in Turkey, and he had used his undercover kind of guards and all of the personnel of the Vatican that he had at his disposal to move documents to rescue thousands of Hungarian Jews in the last months of the war. And as well, and this I think is not all that well known, he also on his own decided to change the prayer life of the Catholic Church, and again, in some ways, trying to move the church into the 20th century. Memoranda reporting on that 1960 meeting reveal that the Pope was immediately responsive to Isaac's entreaty for the impending council. And here you see from the New York Times the announcement on the front page of that council opening in 1962. And one of the things undertaken along with the change of the liturgy, along with its turn to the modern world, will be the development of a document that soon is to be called Nostra Aetate, in our time, from the Latin. Neither Isaac nor the Pope would live to see its proclamation, which was publicly announced by John's successor, Paul VI, in 1965. They died just within months of each other. That document, Nostra Aetate, in remarkable way, has its own place in the Lasansky drawings. Dr. McGarry in the catalog has devoted a major essay to Lasansky's decade-long steadfast at crafting the drawings. And she notes how deeply, jaggedly personal this work was, because of the horrors being memorialized actually touched upon the places from which his parents actually came. Lasansky's parents came from two of the most celebrated Jewish communities in all of Eastern Europe, Kovna and Vilna. And of course, Eichmann had been captured in his hometown of Argentina. So the personal connection was remarkable. What's also evident is not only that personal connection, but how glued he was to the events as they were developing, and collaged into the final sets of drawings in the left panel of the triptych is one of, as Dr. McGarry says, one of the newspaper scraps that he incorporated into the work. As seen here, and you can see in the arrow, as seen here, and this is the full document in its entirety, is that exact New York Times article, which is a blow-by-blow account of the debates that are being thrashed out at the council in its final months, especially on whether or not to include any mention of deicide, the charge that the Jewish people bore and continue to bear ultimate responsibility for Jesus' crucifixion. When, on October the 19th in 1965, the document is finally announced to the public by Pope Paul, there was great relief that the taint of the alleged onus was finally lifted away from the Jewish people, along with a text deploring anti-Semitism and imploring the church and all of its leadership to begin to look differently at Judaism and the Jewish people. It's possible that today we take a lot of this history for granted, but when the event was celebrated first by John Paul II, very famous Pope in our era in 1985, and then when it was celebrated for its anniversary, its Jubilee anniversary, observers noted that it was really a revolutionary document. Given 2 millennia of history, I don't think that's a hyperbole to say. And you can see here, once again, that it is in our time, this document, as Lasansky was completing it, uncommon attention has been directed to every aspect of it. My brief contribution to the catalog does look at the terms of that debate about the relationship of Christianity to the Holocaust and the scholarly appeal, which I think is very important for judicious understanding of the multiple factors that led to a crime perpetrated primarily upon the Jewish people, but millions of other victims as well. Perhaps a final set of slides might serve as a fitting coda to Lasansky's monumental achievement and his yearning for, as he would express it, a rekindling of commitment to human dignity, which is the words that he uses in the initial catalog. One of the standard motifs of the medieval church was to depict the broken, blindfolded synagogue and the triumphant, proud ecclesia, the church. Nostra Aetate, that document, followed over the years by parallel and in some cases, more courageous documents from other faith communities, has prompted today's artists to transform negative imagery like these into these. Tangible, commanding, quite powerful expressions of reconciliation and mutual affirmation for tomorrow. In their own way, these two artworks bespeak more hopeful days ahead for these faith communities, intertwined as they are by history, tragedy, and promise. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Cytron. That was very moving to end with such a positive note. Those are such wonderful allegories. So they were commissioned. One was commissioned by Sister Mary Boys, and that's by Mary Turnbull, the one on the left. And then the other one's is in Philadelphia.
The ones in Philadelphia. So one of the remarkable things is the way Catholic institutions, in this case, this quite famous Catholic university in Philadelphia, St. Joseph, which has a center for Jewish Christian learning, and many places do, including, by the way, I think I should take note of the fact I was honored to serve for over a decade at St. John's University up in Collegeville, and St. John's University was the very first, quite remarkable, the very first university to have a center for Jewish Christian learning, founded in the late 1960s from the largest of the Phillips family, a quite philanthropic family here. And St. John's University is a leader. I think we need to treasure it more than we do from its important place here in Minnesota.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was the very first. Well, that was a wonderful talk. Do we have any questions in the chat, Molly?
Yes, we definitely do. And feel free to drop additional questions in there. We have time for a few today. The first one, Rachel, I think is for you. Aaron writes, these drawings are so intense and moving. And you mentioned that Lasansky was feeling angry and intense emotions when he was producing them. Did Lasansky ever discuss his mental state while producing these and kind of the process of experiencing that?
That's a great question. He did. He talked about it a lot. He has a quote sort of saying, like, I was so angry as a human being, not as an artist, but as a human being, I had to spit it out. Let me see if I can find his exact, I have it quote here. When I made he said this in 1976. So he said, when I made the Nazi drawings, I made them as an angry young man. I wanted to spit it out. My point of view, no rules, nothing, an instinctive reaction. I was upset. I wanted people to know that the world was upset. I am the world, so are you. And so I think it was really, he needed to do it. It had gnawed. He talked also about how it really had gnawed at him for years and years. And what's interesting is we saw some of those early abstract works where he attempted to work on it in printmaking, because he's a printmaker. He's a famous printmaker. But he decided to do this in drawing, because I think he said it was using the most simple media, paper and pencil. Everyone from cradle to grave uses a pencil. And as a person, it was almost like a therapy. He had to, and then he was able to not move on. I mean, but a lot of times we want to retreat from the difficult emotions. And, I'm sure he would, I guess it was a very moving experience when the family visited the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in the 90s. But this was he felt he needed to do this series in the 60s to get his anger out.
Yeah, I think I read that, Rachel, you mentioned that he said, I don't want, I chose something like pencil because I said, I'm not going to do anything beautiful here. Right?
Yes, exactly. And you can see that when you go look at them, he pinned them to plywood supports and he would just tear them, in a way they were not handled with care. It was just, he needed to, they aren't beautiful objects. This isn't an aesthetic thing. This is just a emotional reaction. Absolutely. Yeah, good point.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from Tom, and Tom asks if there's any particular significance to the scripture passages that are featured in the drawing series.
That's such a good question. I don't know if you want to, I was very nervous about having to do careful analysis of all the different scriptures, because there's 6 drawings with multiple, many pages of Hebrew scripture from this 19th century Bible he found in Maine. And what's interesting though, is he often took the page numbers out and headings out. So it's difficult to sometimes even, you can eventually, if you Google enough, or if you're as well-versed, I'm sure, as Rabbi Cytron or something, but if you can Google them, and you can actually, this Bible's on archive.org, so you can actually read and find the pages. But he went to great lengths to sort of obscure the actual, like you're reading from Genesis or you're reading from Exodus. But the words that he highlights, underlines, folds so that you see are clearly have significance in terms of imagery. You know, he's focusing on things like, let's see, like I know there's like passage like of the woman crucified on the cross, he's underlined like jaw teeth of knives and birds of prey pecking at flesh, and things that you then see that imagery in the drawings. And then also just the suffering of the Jews over centuries, you know, the Exodus having the wars, having the children suffering, all that kind of imagery really informed, I think, the imagery of the drawings and his approach. But you might have more to say, Rabbi Cytron, on that.
Well, I first of all, I have to say, and Rachel, I think I'm right in what I want to say here. You're the first person to do this kind of analysis of these drawings. I think we are so beholden to the care with which you have not only looked at the history of the Holocaust, but at these documents, but at these drawings, and unravel them. And when we spoke about one that I focus on in my essay, which is the one, there's one of kind of a hierarchy figure of the church, and the scriptural passages, enigmatically, I guess, are the founding documents of the Jewish people, from the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. And is it by accident, or was Lasansky's Hebrew school back in Argentina coming through in some way there? I don't know, but it was fascinating for me to think about.
Yeah, we ended up, I would print out the pages on archive.org and then staple them together in the forms that they were on the drawings to see, because they would come from different passages, and see if they had juxtapositions. And it was, yeah, I think, well, you said it so well, enigmatically, but also there may be some other levels, you know, of interpretation there for the next generation. We've now cataloged exactly what scripture is in each drawing, so people can inform us about the more layers of meaning.
Yeah, and I would say as well that in terms of thinking about the various headlines from the New York Times, the one that I focused on was kind of the Protestant, the German Protestants supporting the publication by the Catholic Church. That in itself is a kind of interesting moment, that should be happening in 1965. That's almost unheard of. But you kind of wonder whether he was intentional in leaving the headline in such a way that you can now go to the New York Times archives. I put in the headline and popped out the entire article. It was quite remarkable to do.
I think that's a really important point, because on Triptych, the fact that headline is intact, which is so rare in the rest of the drawings, he's really drawing attention to that. Yeah. Because a lot of the times, part of what he does with those newspaper articles, the last triptych, he turns the central figure into a kind of Ku Klux Klan figure wearing this hood. And he has articles about the Selma, the violence of the white supremacists against, you know, peaceful protests going on for integration. And so he's making ties between the violent anti-Semitism and Holocaust in the 1940s and what's going on in the 60s in America, certainly. But then some of the headlines, then he has chatter. He has classified ads for renting a boat, and you can go, you know, and for getting a pet, and for foreign cars. So it's almost like you see that this evil lurks all around, but there's also so much chatter that it's lost. And then I think the fact that the Protestant church support of Vatican II is highlighted is really interesting, because there's other things he really cut away. Yeah. Does that make sense?
We have lots of good questions here in the chat, but we only have time for one more. So Rachel, I'm wondering if you could tell us about the inspiration that led Mia and you to this exhibition, and a little bit more about your collaboration with Rabbi Cytron.
Oh, great question. Okay, so you know, I had known about this series for a long time, because, you know, it's published in the book, and there are Lasanskys there. I'm friends with Leonardo Lasansky in town, an artist, the third son of Mauricio Lasansky, who's a printmaker and retired professor from Hamline University. And so I'd known of them, but we had a dinner one time and he was talking about them and how his wish to see them exhibited again sometime soon. And I went home and I studied the book really carefully, and I was so taken aback by how powerful they are and how much they resonate with our time, and how much, and other things, how they don't resonate with our time. I think it's just as interesting. You know, one scholar says that every era has its own version of the Holocaust in a way, because we are interested in different aspects of this unimaginable tragedy, right? And so things look very different from the 60s. So I was going to propose the exhibition, and I talked to a supporter of the museum, a friend of mine, and a drawings collector, Erwin, Kelen, and was showing him the drawings and said I was thinking about proposing it for Mia. And I was lucky enough to, he was really supportive of the idea. He really wanted to see the drawings come to the museum for exhibition, but he said he knew the Levitts, and so that he could make an introduction. And so then I went to visited them, Mr. and Mrs. Levitt. Mr. Levitt was still alive, still with us in 2017, and proposed the show, and they said they were willing to lend it, the entire series to us. So that's how it began. And we were supposed to mount it last October, but you know, COVID came, and so we've waited a year. So now we have the audience for it. So, and then with Rabbi Cytron, it's a great story, because we were one of the challenges of doing a show like this is even putting it on your website and you say the Nazi drawings. People are going to think you're putting up drawings by Nazis, which we would never do at the museum. And so we were coming up with ways to explain to our audiences right off the bat. And there were protests at the Whitney in New York when they exhibited this, because some people thought that they were showing drawings by Nazis. So I started, you know, there were friends of mine from, you know, in the Jewish community in town, my friends from college. I was sending around 6 to 10 titles that we were considering. And one of my good friends in town, Davida Cytron, I sent it to, and within 5 minutes, I get a call from Rabbi Cytron and her father, and we talk for 2.5 hours. And I realized he's an absolute expert on every issue that I have been trying to get through in the book. And so we met again and invited him to get involved. And he has been an incredible, wise counsel and font of knowledge about, and the bibliography that my book bill went up. But I, you know, just introduced me to so much more of the literature on the specific issues that were being discussed in the 60s, especially. But so that's how that happened, if that answers.
Yeah, and if I can just add one last word, and that is, it's totally, and I don't know, nothing happens by accident, of course. Everything there, all the lines of connection. But our family lived in Des Moines for 11 years. Jean and Richard Levitt were members of the congregation. I pronounced one of the eulogies for Richard Levitt several years ago when he passed away. We consider the Levitts to be among our very closest and dearest friends from our years in Des Moines. And that this should all now come together is quite remarkable. I do want to note, I noted one of the things in the chat that if I can just call attention to, because I think it's really worth calling attention, and that is, there is another exhibit that is worth calling attention to, and that's at the Swedish Museum, and that is of the Kindertransport. So it's quite coincidental, and maybe not coincidental, that two great exhibits are documenting these years now.
And that Kindertransport exhibition at the Swedish Institute is only up till October 31st. So get over there to see that. And it's an amazing thing that both shows are happening. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I'm so happy we had so many people here today. So
thank you for joining us, everyone. And Rachel and Rabbi Cytron, thank you for sharing with us today. And a reminder that the Envisioning Evil exhibition is on view until June 26th of 2022. Thank you for joining us today.